I was in Paris, France, taking care of people's kids. It was the Minister of Agriculture at the time. And they had an apartment in the 20th arrondissement, and it was like a 4-story, like what would be a brownstone in Brooklyn. It was like a 4-story apartment, and the ground floor was my flat. So I got that in exchange for taking care of these 14-year-old and a 10-year-old, and basically speaking English with them, because my French was terrible, and they knew that I would speak English with them. I got the gig, and then invariably people would be passing through, like the Grateful Dead came through, slept a bunch of hippies on the floor, you know, it was amazing. And I didn't go to the show, but good times there. And this kid named James Rowe, he was either the guitar tech or was kicked out of the Screaming Trees, one or the other. But he was associated with the Screaming Trees a little bit. And he's from Los Angeles. James Rowe is his name. And I met him at Shakespeare and Company bookstore. And that's like, it was run by George Whitman, you know, self-proclaimed descendant of Walt Whitman, was running Shakespeare and Company, famous bookstore. I met James there. James was, I was 24, and James was like 22. And he said he had a friend coming to town from Los Angeles named Beck. And he's like, can we put him up for a week? And I was hesitant about it, like another person going to sleep on the floor of my flat, you know. And it was Beck Hansen. He shows up with a small Gibson shoestring strap, no case. He had a Gibson guitar with a shoestring for a strap, and I could tell within one day I could tell there was something different about this guy. And yeah, he knew Woody Guthrie songs, you know, like that just wasn't a thing at that time. 1990, 91, there wasn't. I understood folk music, and I was into Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee and such, but I wasn't like the Woody Guthrie jukebox that you hear about in certain cases, and he was.
You guys were both kids, weren't you?
Yeah, I'm 24. He's 21 at this time. But I remember a few things right off the bat. It's like I had a Rolling Stone issue, and this would pin it to the date. I had a Rolling Stone issue that had Paleface was one of the new artists in it. And there's a thing about Beck being in New York City during the anti-folk scene, and he meets Paleface, and he crimps a little bit of Paleface's vibe or style or whatever, which is very common, right, with musicians, and especially folk musicians, like the whole...
They're influenced by other people.
Yeah, basically like Ramblin' Jack, Woody Guthrie, Bob Dylan, that whole imitation thing. So he sees Paleface in the Rolling Stone that week, and he's like, I know that guy. So that's the first time I was standing next to somebody who's like, who knows a guy that's in Rolling Stone. And at this time, we're playing the streets. We're playing the Steps of Montmartre. We're playing Beaubourg. We're playing the Centre Pompidou. Like, we're just busking, basically. But Beck had original songs that we were busking. One of them was called Going Nowhere Fast. One of them was called Let's Go Set Something on Fire. And these are songs that are immediately catchy, and we're backing them up. So it's 3 dudes, 3 acoustic guitars, and Beck wrote a story about it, an essay about it in Annie Leibowitz's American Music book. So that's a book, like a coffee table book of American musicians, and it's mostly photographs, but Beck has an essay in there. And in the essay he mentions like staying at a flat in Paris, you know, but it was my flat, and or the one I was living in that year. And there is one specific story about us going up onto the steps of Montmartre, which is where you would play, right? Up in Sacré-Cœur, and beautiful vision of Paris, and the sun would be setting, and we'd all get some, you know, bottles of wine, and we'd play. And it's true that there would be other busking groups, like there was a group of Middle Eastern guys who just would crush it with like Mrs. Robinson and the Hotel California, and they were nailing it, you know, they had harmony parts and everything. And then there was us, three scruffy dudes playing whatever we could. And he writes about that in this essay, so you can look that up, or I don't think it's online anywhere. I think you have to actually find the book to read his essay. But the story that he doesn't talk about there that I took part in is when the three of us walked to Père Lachaise to Jim Morrison's grave. So that's my neighborhood basically, and invariably when someone would come to visit, we would go to the grave. It's just a thing you did, right?
Yeah.
Like Oscar Wilde's grave is on the way. There's other graves, but let's face it, it's the Jim's grave that they know it's the infamous one. It's all graffitied up.
Yeah.
You know, there's graffiti on other graves that point towards his grave. It's sad and also fascinating, right? So
it's one of the more famous grave photos that you'll see.
Yeah, and it's changed through the years, and they'll clean it up. And I mean, Père Lachaise is a beautiful park to walk around in. It's a quiet place to go in the middle of a bustling city. So we go there with our guitars, out of the cases. We're three dudes walking down the street with Gibsons, walking down the street, and we go to the grave, and we're playing some songs. I don't think we're necessarily playing Doors songs. I think we're just playing what we knew, we meet three girls from Iceland, and the six of us then go back to my apartment where we make them spaghetti and break out the guitars again and start singing songs. And then as soon as we started doing that, they're like, we have to go now. So we basically picked up these three girls from Iceland who were, young kids, and we were all young, we were just like hitting the scene. And there was a scene happening at his grave, so we meet these three girls, bring them back to my place, make them dinner, start to sing, they leave. That's the story. And then Beck wrote me a letter about it. About a year later, I'm back home, so we're getting the early 90s, and we're exchanging analog mail, letters. And the last letter he sent me had a cassette with what mostly became One Foot in the Grave sessions, and but he had a mix of Loser on there.
Really?
So and that mix had a little bit more like of George Bush's. There was voiceover stuff like I'm a fighter. There's some part where George Bush actually says some things that didn't quite make the final single, but there's like an early mix by the Dust Brothers, what were they called, whatever that production team was, and he sent me that, and I heard it, and I'd never heard it at that time, right? Hip hop and folk music there wasn't an example of that.
Yeah.
And he, in the letter he said, I've been getting into hip hop lately. And I'm in Ohio at this time, right? And so I don't really comprehend exactly what's going on with his Los Angeles vibe. But it's folk music, but now there's a huge beat behind it, and he's kind of rapping over this part with this Mexican Spanish chorus was soy perdidor, I'm a loser. And that I just went over to my friend's house and go, listen to this. And then we went over to someone else's house and said, listen to this. Then we went over to someone else. We went to 4 different musicians' houses and played it. And we all just sat there and we're like, this is incredible. And it was a year later, but it was a year before it was on the radio. And then I heard it.
Do you remember the first time you heard it on the radio or
I
saw the video?
do. Absolutely do, because I crossed the country in a VW bus, and this is kind of a big year for me going across the country in an old VW bus, and I was coming back from the West Coast, and I was going to go to my first South by Southwest, and I didn't have a gig, I wasn't accepted, I just knew that's where I had to go, and I heard it. I was in Arizona, and I heard it on the radio, the same song. And that's when I knew something was going on. Turns out I get to South by Southwest. Beck is playing a gig with Johnny Cash opening the show. I know, it's
the music business.
Yeah, it's either 96, so you can look this up, but I'm like, what do you mean Johnny Cash is opening the show at Emo's, the punk rock bar, like down on 6th Street? And that was, Rick Rubin was there. It was the beginning of Johnny Cash's re-emergence in the American, with those new songs. And it blew my mind. I'm talking to Beck on the street. He's like, I don't know what's happening. I'm like, I know what's happening. And and he had a handler who was trying to push him away from, bring him away from me. Like, Beck, we got to go do stuff. And I'm trying to talk to him, and he had people pulling him along. And we were old buds from the streets and stuff. So he was a little bit embarrassed about that. And then a limo pulls up. Johnny Cash gets out of it, and I remember being so close to Johnny Cash that I could put my hand on his shoulder.
Wow.
And just say, thank you. And he's like, yeah, you're welcome. And then the crowd just came, right? And that show, kind of a legendary show. The backing band for Beck was some of the guys that became
Presidents of the United States?
The Presidents of the United States, the Peaches, but yeah. Okay. Those guys were in the band. But that was the band. And it wasn't great. Musically, it had a punk rock vibe to it. Like, they couldn't recreate Loser. They couldn't recreate that stuff yet. He wasn't, it wasn't huge yet, like where he could afford to have this great band behind him, or they hadn't given him the money to do that yet. But 2 weeks later in Columbus, Ohio, I did interview him in the back of that VW bus, and those interviews are on my YouTube channel now, and anybody can listen to them. And they're not like that developed of an interview. Mm-hmm. Like, I just happened to have a cassette going while I was supposed to talk to him for this underground magazine in my town. But we were all just still not sure what was happening. Like, Beck wasn't a household name or anything yet, but he was about to be, So, and at that same time, Kurt Cobain, the time when I'm talking to Beck in the back of my VW bus with my friend Joe Cirillo there, who ended up playing washboard with him that night. The time we're doing that, at that exact moment, Kurt Cobain's body was laying undiscovered in Seattle. Wow. It turns out, because the next day, both Beck and my band, the Haynes Boys, had a gig in Chicago, and Beck canceled because he was sick, and we heard Kurt Cobain had died from a DJ as we were driving in Chicago that night. And he was on tour with a band called That Dog, and they ended up playing the show, but Beck didn't play the show. He'd caught a cold or something. And that's almost the last time I interacted with him, except that when I finally moved to Los Angeles, I kind of snuck out there under cover of night. I didn't really break up. The band didn't break up that I was with. I just stopped playing with them. Yeah, that's the way to do it. It's like, don't break up the band, just leave town and don't tell anybody. And they all had other bands that they were in that had deals going. So I realized that I was in a band with a bunch of guys that were, that my band that I wrote the songs for, was kind of a side project for them. So I just left town and came down to Nashville and made a record with Brad Jones, and then moved out to Los Angeles because it was just inviting at the time. And pretty early on in that experience, I was at the health food store in Los Feliz, and I was standing in line at the health food store, and I noticed the cashier was like mesmerized with the person next to me. She just had, her jaw was down, and I looked over and it was Beck. He's standing next to me, and I said, "Oh, hey, man." He's like, "Oh, hey, how's it going?" And we talked outside, and I can't get enough of this humor of this, really. We talked outside. We're having a good time. We're catching up. And it's time for me to get his phone number, right? We have cell phones. I had my first cell phone. It's 2001, something like that. And he gives me his number, and I just put it on my phone, and I don't call him for a couple weeks. I don't think about it. Then eventually I'm like, oh, I'll check in with Beck because I'm about to do something in Los Angeles. And it just rang and rang. It just rang and rang and rang. So I'm like, that's interesting. He doesn't have an outgoing message, or nothing happens. And then it hit me about a week later. I was like, oh, he's got 2 phone numbers. One just rings and rings and rings. So he gave me the phone. I was like, oh man, that is brilliant. He's so famous that he has that phone, that he has the one number that just keeps on ringing. And that was the last time I saw him at a Grammy party a little bit later when we discussed some of that. I didn't bring up the phone thing, but I was like, yeah, fair play to you there, you know. And that's, you know, all that time, you know, he's making records and crushing it, and basically breaking the mold for a lot of singer-songwriters, just combining genres that most people, you know, didn't do. And then you find out later about the Scientology stuff, and I never really let that get in the way of my thoughts about him as an artist. But I tried really to back off and just say, hey, that's his path in life, and let's not judge everybody on what their parents did or what their parents got them into, you know, because I think that's the case.
Artistically, it's really refreshing that he was able to just dabble in whatever kind of music he wanted to,
right? And
his audience followed him to each of those. It's you don't get a lot of that.
I think that's why I ask people when I'm talking to someone, a songwriter, I ask them, what records did your parents play? You know, because let's mention this. When I met him in Paris, and he was a 20-year-old man running around with a Gibson guitar with no case. He had just left Germany, where he was visiting his grandfather, Al Hansen, who was part of the Fluxus art movement. Fluxus, Fluxus, I think. Fluxus art. It was he was part of a movement that built art out of garbage. He was using like cigarette butts and stuff to make sculptures, and he was definitely out there as an artist, you know, as a sculptor. And so Beck had been just hanging out with his grandfather, basically, and that's what he was doing in Europe at that time. So I learned about that, and there was some mention of John and Yoko in there as well, like either his parents or I think his grandfather had done something involved with Yoko at some point as well, just as modern artists, you know. Yeah, there was like deeper stuff going on when you meet a guy whose family was somehow associated with that kind of, with art in that way, that high art world, which I didn't comprehend at that time. You know, I'm still a young kid, just rambling around trying to learn how to write songs.
Yeah.
And Beck had songs that were immediately singable, and I still sing one of them, Going Nowhere Fast. It was just a 3-chord thing. Had a bit of a Dylan, Woody Guthrie vibe to it, and they were just instantly singable. And we would back him up on the streets of Paris, and then, you know, we would take turns doing songs. Yeah.
So you have the recording of the interview that you did with Beck back then in your VW bus on your YouTube channel.
I do.
And I'm going to put a link to that down below maybe in the top comment or something.
Yeah.
Subscribe to Tim's channel and give that a good listen.
It's a pretty slow interview, but it also does, like, he's playing my guitar while he's talking to us, and he's playing old folk songs. You can hear that part of his existence is real. Like, he didn't just wake up one day and like be, you know, crushing it with the hip hop and folk music. Like, he had a huge knowledge of folk music. Absolutely, yeah.
All right. I think that's it.
I think that was plenty of Beck story. I mean, that's pretty much it. You know, it's like one day I'm sure I'll cross paths with him again. You know, but it's.